Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So tonight, we have a slightly different cast of a proper subset of the Shop Talk hostery. Below, we're going to start in the opposite order of normal because Tracy doesn't have her mic muted yet. So, Tracy Baggiano, how you doing?
I'm up top, but that's just on my screen.
Yeah,
I'm doing fine. How's everybody else?
Everybody sees you at the bottom.
I know.
It's not a relative ranking, but I will say that
yeah.
we're gonna cut the bottom 20% of
I'm
employees.
just in the lower 33% today. That's okay. I can accept that.
And to my right, Mala Mahadevan. How you doing, Mala? Mala is doing just fine, but is currently muted, and that's all right. We can read lips here at Shop Talk.
Hello, everyone. Sorry about that.
We can read lips so well that it's almost like we can hear her speak.
Whoa, we're doing good.
Doing an excellent job of that. So, Shop Talk. Basically, we meet once every couple weeks, talk shop. It's water cooler style conversation. We talk about some issues of the day. A lot of it's data platform related. Although tonight we've got a little bit that's not data platform related on the show notes. We'll see how far we get to that before somebody inevitably derails us in chat. Speaking of chat, you chat are the most wonderful people for Shop Talk, because otherwise it'd just be us talking into the ether. And although we could do that, you're here to keep things interesting. It's like those people who make the World Atlas with South America, Australia, and Antarctica at the top. Yeah, I mean, I don't do that because then all the water flows out of the map. That's why you keep the map on the normal side, then the water doesn't fall out. I thought that was scientifically, everybody knew that. So let's get on with our agenda for tonight. The first topic is Past Data Community Summit is coming up very quickly. Mala, do you have anything you want to talk about tonight with Past Data Community Summit?
All I have to say is, I suppose if you've been following along, you know Brent Ozar is doing the keynote on the second day on the cloud and our careers. I'm sure he's really, really good at that kind of stuff, and I would listen if I could. Even if I don't have time for anything else, it may be worth a listen. I know that the sessions are going to be recorded, but it's going to take quite some time before they get published. So it might be worth the conference. It's 100% free. So sign up and watch while it happens. That might be fun. Yep. I think we discussed pre-cons already, but if we haven't signed up for pre-cons, $200 for a day-long class is a really good use of money. And my employer said okay to it. I hope other people get approval too, and it's worth attending. Some really good classes on that list.
Yeah, for sure. There's a nice list of pre-cons. Everything starts about 15 days from now, so check it out. We'll have one more opportunity to try to goad you into going to Past Data Community Summit. One more Shop Talk before then. Okay, next thing is on our agenda. We had a couple of different people. Mike couldn't be here tonight. He actually brought up this topic originally, and we didn't have time for it last time because chat, you successfully filibustered. Good job on you all. And in the meantime, Mala had somebody reach out to her asking roughly a very similar question. So we're going to bundle the two together and take it as a topic. And that is, what do you use for query editing? So open question. Everyone here, go ahead, put in your answers as well. Management Studio, Azure Data Studio. Mike specifically brought up a tool called Aqua Data Studio, which is a more multi-platform type of tool. I know other people have used like dbeaver. There are other tools that are going to be more multi-platform. I don't think I've heard anybody use Toad for SQL Server in like a decade, and that's probably for the best. If you are a Toad for SQL Server user, keep using your product. You know, I'm not gonna go uninstall it from your computer. I'm not your real dad, but I haven't heard too many people who are really big on that. So Mala says Management Studio. Red Yellow says Management Studio.
I have another option for you.
What do you got,
I know
Tracy?
a developer that still uses Notepad++.
Notepad++.
I don't use it, but I know someone that does.
Yeah, I guess technically the question was query editing. It wasn't full IDE, so Notepad++. That's
You
an
said
option.
query editing. Yep.
I use
It
TextPad.
has IntelliSense for it and everything. So
I use TextPad. If editing of the query text is all that is needed, TextPad works really well for me. But
I need a color
I
coding.
thought the question was editing with some amount of intelligence attached to it, which is SSMS, of course.
Yeah, well, Notepad has it too because it has the IntelliSense built into it. It at least color codes the SQL syntax for you. So
Got it.
I need the color coding. I'm just one of those one. I do typos a lot, so I need the color coding.
So I'm really bad with formatting. So that's why I use TextPad, and TextPad is very helpful to format. The formatting standards we have at work are not SSMS friendly. So TextPad works better for us.
I just use Redgate for that, or some other tool, and just click, or just manually do it in SSMS while I'm writing it.
Yep.
So are we
Or
talking
Azure Data Studio.
about formatting with regards to the tool, Kevin, or is there anything else that is being discussed?
So at this really high level, I mean, it was really just what he used for query editing. Lysanki in chat says Notepad++, use it for many things. Oh yeah, I think we all do. Solomon says Management Studio, but Notepad++ for pretty much everything else. I think it's Notepad++ is definitely one of the best text editors that's available in the Windows platform.
And I derailed the conversation a tad bit on the ADS and the SSMS by a question I was asked by a Microsoft employee.
No.
Why aren't people adopting ADS more?
Do you have an answer for that, or do you want me to try to wing it?
No, I have a DBA at my current job that just totally hates it. So she was trying to find out why this is happening in the community. There are some people that are they had a conniption fit when it was included in an installer with SSMS.
Yep.
And they're trying to figure out why everybody is just so hateful on the product. So I was just curious if anybody had shared the same hatred, because I can't, besides the fact that it's not SSMS, he does not have a reason for why he doesn't like it. So I go either way because I open it up. I use notebooks and ADS some, so I have a tendency to start using ADS more when I'm doing development work. But when I'm using admin work, I go in SSMS because it has more of the admin stuff in it. So I'm kind of back and forth. And because I'm using notebooks aren't in SSMS. So, and I use VS Code a lot too. So I'm kind of like in 3 different editors. I don't really use Notepad++. That was someone else. So I just thought I'd throw that one in there too and make it a whole rounded conversation, because I do have a Microsoft employee that's pretty curious about that.
That is a really good question. I think Mala, I'm gonna see what Mala has to say first before I try to respond. Uh-oh.
She's frozen.
Mala has frozen up. So, as Mala comes back in here, why hasn't there been much more uptake on Azure Data Studio? I think there are a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is Azure Data Studio is still very lacking in terms of functionality versus Management Studio. And
Admin-wise.
that's something that has changed over time. We have seen more things introduced, and there are fewer cases of this simply doesn't have X. There are still a good number of things that Azure Data Studio does not have, which Management Studio does, and which some percentage of database developers, database administrators do require for their jobs. There are still plenty of widgets and helpers and wizards. I did let Mala in. Uh-oh, she dropped right out. I swear, chat, I swear I let her in. There we go.
We don't believe you.
I don't think
You
I
look
believe
so
you at
dishonest
this point.
tonight.
That's twice now that I've let Mala in, and nope, no dice. So Azure Data Studio is missing a lot of functionality that is in Management Studio. And starting off, I think that's just a really important baseline. There are differences in the way that you would use the two tools. And that is very weird.
What's Mala saying?
There we go. So differences in the way that you would use the two tools. And I guess that has driven some of the... Oh, here's Mala.
Unknown knock status is here.
There we go.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right, so Tracy's been promoted to top right. Mala's been promoted to top left, which means that we may be firing me by the end of this episode. We'll find out. But
I don't know. If you drop off, doesn't the whole thing close?
So what did I miss with regards to ADS and SSMS?
You missed a lot of me dancing around the question.
Yeah, just basically saying there's not enough features in ADS that SSMS has that admins would use.
So we don't fall in neat little boxes as developers and DBAs, and even if that were to be true, there are things they're doing that don't seem to add up to ADS being a developer-only tool. Like I was telling Kevin before here, they've now said managed instances can be managed via ADS, and I don't see a developer doing that. That's a DBA job. But that's gone to ADS, so I'm not entirely sure the purpose of these two things. And because the way we work at work is more suited to SSMS, and I find the ADS interface annoying to begin with, although I might get used to it if that's what I have to use. So I stick with SSMS for that reason, that's all.
Yeah, so I don't think the difference of one is intended for DBAs, one is intended for database developers, I don't think that was ever really a smart choice on Microsoft's side for marketing.
Right,
I know
right.
that is a choice that they made in marketing. Honestly, I think it was a wrong decision because, like you said, Mala, a lot of people do both of them. And also, you're seeing things that are Azure Data Studio only, which are more administrative. The reason they're in Azure Data Studio is Azure Data Studio has a much better plugin model than the one available in Management Studio. This is the difference between using the Visual Studio Code shell, which is very much intended for plugins, and the Visual Studio 2012 shell, which is okay with plugins, but needed a lot more effort to get one built.
Right.
And so
I like that about Azure Data Studio. I will easily admit that the plugin add-in is super clever and easy.
Yeah. Now, also keeping it updated. Ironically, keeping it updated is the thing that I like a lot, but it's also a point of contention with some of the people who strongly disliked what Tracy was talking about, bundling together Management Studio and Azure Data Studio, because Azure Data Studio updates on a monthly cadence. And if you have a really strong, really strict security environment that says we're only going to allow specific versions of software, specific patch levels of software, and you have Management Studio 18.9, well, what version of Azure Data Studio do you have? Is it updating behind the scenes, even if you're not actively using Azure Data Studio, but it was just installed as part of 18?
And in our case, it would not be because we're putting it on jump boxes that are inside our domain that don't have access to the internet. Like we do have them on our local laptops, but the servers where we're accessing our actual servers would not be updating except for when we download a new version of SSMS.
Yeah, and in that case, are you now are you maintaining software which hasn't necessarily gone through security approval, isn't auto-updating because it doesn't have the opportunity to, and could possibly have security vulnerabilities? Maybe. So that was a lot of the controversy that I saw around bundling the two products together. To answer a question from Solomon, do either Azure Data Studio or Visual Studio Code handle large result sets well, especially multiple result sets? They handle it pretty well. You still have the risk of out of memory error type problems that you get with Management Studio. You still have slowness. The Electron browser, the Electron platform that's being used for Visual Studio Code, that's being used for Azure Data Studio, does have its limits with regard to how much data it wants to show. But I've been able to export things much larger than what I could in Management Studio. So, I mean, I've been able to save to CSV 2-3 million rows worth of large data sets.
So does ADS have scripting, Kevin?
Sorry, Azure Data Studio has what now?
Can you script objects in it? In a while.
Very limited. It's not nearly as complete as what you get with Management Studio. So you get the script as create.
Right.
But it's still not nearly as complete. I mean, an advantage to Management Studio is they've had the core of that for the last 16 years. They've had a long time to build it up. The disadvantage to it is adding anything new to it now actually is pretty difficult. And
someone at work actually recently educated us on the search files option that SSMS has, and I really like that. I haven't known about it much or used it, and I find it extremely useful for repo searches and such. It's really neat.
Yeah.
You can even save a search if you like.
Yep. That's there. Now, that's also available in its own form in Azure Data Studio. So it's in both products. And I think at the end of the day, that's another problem with why you don't see much adoption, is that it's in both products. Like, there are some things which are Azure Data Studio only, or where the convenience lies in Azure Data Studio. Things like notebooks are going to be Azure Data Studio only, except for that weird integration with Management Studio. The Easy Loader, the loading process that's available in Azure Data Studio that was imported into Management Studio, one of the reasons why they had the SSMS installer also give you Azure Data Studio. That kind of stuff is finding its way into Management Studio, but it's finding its way in as essentially calling Azure Data Studio under the covers and doing the work.
What exactly do you mean by loading process?
I believe it was the file import, the new file importer.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Oh yeah, that.
Yep. So you have these things which, yes, those are new, and they may be reasons to use Azure Data Studio, but 99% of the job, I know I can use Management Studio on because I've used Management Studio on it for 15 years, say a lot of database administrators and developers. Azure Data Studio being a new product, they're looking at it and saying, I can only do like 60% of my job, and I'd rather do this in one tool where I can do 100% of my job, even if this other tool for specific purposes may be better for my whatever workflow that I have. So I think that's a big part of the why around take-up. And database people tend to be slower moving than a lot of other software platforms. Like Visual Studio Code, I'm pretty sure there are more VS Code developers than Visual Studio developers at this point. Visual Studio Code has absolutely taken off. And once you get outside the, .NET, the .NET shop that has been doing the same .NET coding for the past 12 years, once you get outside of that group, VS Code is extremely popular. And so it's considering that this is the same Electron platform, you would think, hey, Azure Data Studio may be similarly popular, but no, I'm pretty sure a lot of this comes down to database people are much more resistant to any sort of change, and usually for good reason, because change is typically a terrible thing that just breaks stuff. So I think it's a difference in personality, difference in temperance, and that there haven't really been too many great features that are really necessitating the use of Azure Data Studio. Notebooks is probably the best of those features, and you're starting to see people who will use Azure Data Studio specifically for the notebooks, but that's still a fairly small percentage of all data platform specialists. I think it should be a higher percentage. I do like notebooks, especially for the cases where you have a whole bunch of scripts, the
Yes.
folder full of script files that everybody has.
Mm-hmm. I'm making a lot of diagnostic notebooks myself.
Yeah,
for
exactly.
things
Making
like
run
Compton, I'm in PowerShell
That's
and
just
SQL
very
things.
convenient for data issues, for DBAs, for many things.
So there's a benefit here.
Okay.
Lysanki asks, is it because Visual Studio Code doesn't run like Eclipse or Visual Studio in slow motion? Yeah, and the ironic thing there is, and yet it's still using Electron, but it's so much faster than those other products. So that's my Electron bashing of the day. We're really hoping to see the end of Java applications. I would not be very much opposed to that, honestly. Although what's funny is that I did install a Java app on my Linux laptop this weekend, so I'm part of the problem. In fairness, it was a game, so I guess I don't know if that counts or not. JavaScript is fast. I have so many jokes. I don't even know where to begin. It's been optimized and optimized again and again. Yes, and one of these days it'll finally be optimal. But that's query editing. So the Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, seems like in chat a lot of people say, hey, Management Studio. I didn't really have anybody explicitly call out Azure Data Studio. I do use that here most of the time. When I'm doing office work, I'm using Management Studio, and that's because of a third-party product that I've bought that allows me to do formatting like Mala was talking about. And otherwise, here, mostly Azure Data Studio and almost all Visual Studio Code. I actually don't even have Visual Studio installed on this desktop. I almost had to because of some crappy old application that I needed to support, but I ended up having VS Community installed on a laptop, and I was able to use that instead. So I got around having to install Visual Studio on this machine. There are faster browser texts. Yeah, there are definitely texts that are faster. I guess, in fairness to Electron, it is fast. It is a memory hog, but it is fast. Until it's not fast, but usually it's because it's causing memory problems. But Electron is also cross-platform, and I do appreciate that a lot. So the fact that Visual Studio Code runs and looks basically the same running on Linux as it does on Windows, I'm okay with that. Same thing with Azure Data Studio, that I can install it. Installation was easy. It kind of just works. So I was pretty happy with that overall. So speaking of open source, have we got a fun story here? So this is just from a few days ago, and technically it's not data platform related, but because we love a good bit of controversy here on Shop Talk, The Verge had an article about Microsoft pulling out hot reload from the open source Visual Studio Code shortly, like when it became a release candidate. So it was still in Visual Studio, but that would be the only place where you could get it. Now, Visual Studio is not Linux friendly at all. Visual Studio Code is very Linux friendly. There was a huge amount of controversy about this, especially because the hot reload code had actually been available. It was in the open source version of the latest version of .NET, and yeah, in .NET 6. So it was actually in the code base, and they yanked it out. And the reason was that there were priority changes. So they wanted to prioritize other activities, and it kind of sounded like the PM saying, we'll get back to it later. Well, this had everybody go nutso, and for fair reason, because I mean, hot reload is a really important thing, especially if you're a plugin developer in the .NET environment. And hot reload is also something that people are very familiar with on other platforms. So this was Microsoft playing catch up, trying to make it available. And in that article from The Verge, we have Phil Carter, who used to be on the F# team. He was a PM on the F# team. He's a good guy. He left Microsoft. He had a post that basically said that, if you look at the source code, it's only about 1,200. It's about 1,000 to 2,000 lines of code, and that code was ripped out at the last moment. Given that hot reload did not start out as being specifically for Visual Studio, it seemed a little awkward, and hopefully it's not the start of a pattern, says Carter. And after a couple of days, Microsoft backed down, and I've got another link here where they're going to allow for hot reload support through the CLI. So this was, who wrote this one? Was that Mr. Guthrie? No, it doesn't look like Scott Guthrie. One of the many Scotts at Microsoft. And Scott Hunter. I could tell it wasn't Scott Guthrie because he wasn't wearing a red polo. So Scott Hunter put out this post, basically says, we kind of messed up. We didn't think that there was going to be this much in the way of a community response, but oops. And they brought this back, made it available, and said that basically they did prioritize putting it in Visual Studio because it's product management. They have to prioritize, we're going to do A or B, and can't necessarily get all of it in. That was their reasoning. Now, the question is, given the fact pattern, which outcome is more likely? Was it that A, hey, we're getting close to deadlines, we have to pull something, you know what, with this, let's pull this out, and that way we don't have to support it, we don't have to troubleshoot it, make sure everything works appropriately, because that could be a problem, and we just don't have the time to do this. And then the community got very angry about that because, hey, it was already here. You should really prioritize this a lot higher than you have. Or B, that they really did want this to be Visual Studio. Here's a convincing reason to use Visual Studio, because at this point, you kind of really need a convincing reason to use Visual Studio, people. VS Code is that much better. And so possibly trying to create that convincing reason, and then after seeing the amount of backlash, they come back and say, ooh, well, you know what, maybe let's not do this. Maybe let's release this out to the general public, and then say, oops, sorry, that was just a business decision. And I think the fact pattern actually fits both of them. What do you think, chat? What have you got for me? What do you think, Tracy?
I'm just glad they put it back because, it's a good feature.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, makes your troubleshooting your code easier, and it's kind of lame to rip it out last minute unless you got a good reason.
Right, which it sounds like they didn't.
which we don't know what the reason is because they didn't really tell us what it was. So the fact that they put it back in so quickly tells us that maybe they didn't have a good reason.
Quite possibly.
So whereby doesn't like my camera suddenly for some reason. So I agree with everything Tracy's saying in that regard. I'm going to jump out and jump in again and see what it does.
Our correspondent from Inside a Darkened Room.
I know she looks like she's like I don't know what that reminds me of, but it reminds me of something.
Alien abduction video.
That's probably it.
You've got really low quality.
We probably should go check on her. We know where she lives. After Shop Talk, we only got 30 minutes. If she doesn't make it back, we might want to end early and one of us go check on her.
There you go. We'll do a welfare check.
We can Twitter her, make sure she didn't get abducted too.
Well, unless the aliens do have really long fingers, so it may be difficult for them to type on a phone.
Yeah, no. They could do it on the computer because she is on her computer right now, and it's open and not locked. So they could.
That's true. So,
let's see. She did not get abducted by aliens. That
we know of. I mean,
you're still here, right?
You're
not an alien.
I don't think I am. I don't believe I am.
Okay, we were just debating what that way your screen was looking, whether that looked like an alien abduction video. So
it did.
Whether we needed to do a welfare check on you or not after Shop Talk or during Shop Talk.
So, looks like quiet chat. I actually kind of expected either I'm having problems with chat or chat's having problems with me. But that's okay.
Or you don't have enough developers on.
That could be. It could be that people are like, I don't know anything about this topic, and would you please just move on before...
I just happened to hear about it Saturday when I was scrolling through Twitter, because I don't keep up with much anymore, and I don't scroll through Twitter much.
I was reading Randolph's thread on something he tweeted about it. That's how I
found it.
Chris Woodruff, the two of them. Yeah.
Yeah, and this did cause a lot of controversy. Rednello says I wasn't aware of it. It was within the open source community. There was a lot of controversy around it, but given that Microsoft did change their policy within, or they changed the operation within like one day. This post went out October 22nd at 5 p.m. from The Verge. On October 23rd, Scott Hunter has his blog post. So they reversed course pretty quickly. Probably reprioritized it. Said, well, let's just go. So, got a question from chat. How do we feel about Postgres? On the whole, I'm fine with. I like Postgres. It is. I would say that if you're going to use an open source database, it is the best open source database. I don't think there's much doubt about that. I think that it's absolutely viable production system, like enterprise level system. It's definitely not my wheelhouse. There are things that I do like about it, and there are things that I'm not familiar enough with it to really say too much about. I do enjoy the plugin, like that, the multi-language support for things like functions and procedures. I think that's a really nice aspect of Postgres, and also it tends to be on the forefront of ANSI language support. So as the baseline for what ANSI SQL looks like changes, Postgres is usually among the first to get it implemented. Their implementations aren't always the best, but I think on the whole they do a good job. And so yeah, there's a lot of community support and add-ins, like Sankey says. It is overall really good data platform technology. It's not my preferred technology, but people who use it seem to enjoy it, and my limited experience with it has been pretty positive. What do you think, Tracy? You were shrugging your shoulders indecisively.
Well, I've just been at a few companies that have talked about moving to Postgres, and then it's kind of like out of SQL, and it's just like, how are they going to get there? And I agree, Postgres is a good open source database platform, and it's probably the best one out there from what I've seen. From what I've heard and seen, and as far as companies picking it. But I haven't had to work with it to be able to voice a definitive opinion one way or the other on it. So, but if you had to go open source and your company's not wanting to go with something paid for, that would have, because I'm assuming you wouldn't have support. I don't think there's a company that provides support for Postgres, but you wouldn't have support for it, and you were comfortable with that, then that would be a viable way to go.
Yeah, there are
So
companies.
I moved two databases off of Postgres into SQL Server where I work now. That was my first and only experience with it, Kevin. And I didn't see this problem happen, but what I was told is that they had a lot of problems with concurrency, even with those small databases, and that was the main reason they wanted to move it back.
We did get some error messages constantly paging us out of those Postgres servers. I remember that, but I don't know if that's possibly because we never actually upgraded the version of Postgres since I was there. And I was there 6 years and it never got upgraded. Just saying it got fixed in a future version. But there was no DBAs there that knew Postgres well enough to want to touch it to upgrade it. So
I found it really easy to understand, like as long as you know the basics of a relational database, it was just no big deal at all to understand how it works, and code around it and all of that was like super, super easy. So I didn't have any issues with getting around it, but I don't know what the bigger issues were, like the actual usage on the applications. I was told it was concurrency where I was.
Yeah, we kept getting PG bouncer errors, I think, if I remember correctly. And I can't remember what the solution was to fix it because it's been a while. But like I said, the whole time I was at the same company. So the whole time I was there, like we didn't touch them as far as upgrading them. So there could have been a fix, or there could have been something that someone could have investigated further to try to fix it, as far as I know. But I was never asked to look at it, so I didn't.
Yeah, Red Nello asks, any security concerns with Postgres? I mean, short answer is yes, which will be true for every product. So there are some high CVE scores, basically same general strategy with everything else. Keep things patched, patch them to the latest versions if you can. Make sure you test your patches. There are guides for hardening Postgres. I think a part of the problem is just moving from one data platform technology to another. The development side is usually a lot easier than the administrative side.
Yeah.
And on the developer side, hey, we're all writing SQL. Yeah, sure, there's different functionality in terms of how I create procedures and what procedures mean, like a procedure in Oracle and a procedure in SQL Server, completely different stories. Certain ways of writing code, cursors versus non-cursored code. In SQL Server, it makes a huge difference. In Oracle, you create cursors. It's a thing. So there are, aside from those stumbling blocks, there's a lot less in terms of getting you off the ground and more stumbling blocks on the administrative side. Just understanding how you set things up, how you configure, how you secure accounts, how you perform appropriate patching, how you lay out disks. That this is not going to be generic, applies to all platforms types of advice. How you index tables is going to differ based on your platforms. And given that Postgres historically came out of Oracle, that it was Oracle developers who wanted implementations that Oracle, the company, wasn't really willing to offer. They went out and built their own platform to do exactly that. And therefore, many of their internal core choices have been similar to Oracle. Like that was their experiences. So if you're coming at it from an Oracle side, you'll probably find it easier. But Yeah, with SQL Server, it's Oracle all the way down. Yeah. I wanted to be polite about it. But yeah, actually, my recollection is that even today, a fair number of the key contributors are still Oracle employees. And so, if you're more familiar with that side of the data platform world, you'll find the transition a lot easier. If you come at it from Postgres to SQL Server or from SQL Server to Postgres, it is a little bit more of a challenge. And I think that does lead to like the problems Mala was talking about, where you have people who are used to one technology and then they go and try to use this other platform because they're all the same. And then it ends up being terrible. It's not necessarily the platform itself is terrible. I'm biting my tongue really hard not to make a MongoDB joke here.
I started to mention that earlier, but I just didn't. Just don't go with that, and you're safe.
In fairness to all the Mongo people, Mongo's fine. Mongo's fine. But it is going to be my whipping boy forever. But yeah, a lot of this comes down to, do you have the skills, experience, and knowledge with the particular platform? Because a lot of that information is not immediately transferable. And if you don't have those, do you know where to look? Do you know how to perform, like how to skill up? And do you have the time to do it? I would say if you're a DBA, it is definitely a good idea to be familiar with more than one data platform technology. If you use SQL Server day in and day out, it's good to be as familiar as you can be in that space. But I think there's also value in at least understanding at least one other platform, even if you don't want to work with it for a living, just because it helps you understand some of the decisions that are made. And by having a contrast, you kind of learn to appreciate what decisions, what trade-offs the various vendors have had to maintain. So that's what I've got on the topic of Postgres. Mala or Tracy, anything you want to add?
Nope.
Okay, so now let's get to what I'll call the fun story of the day. And for the first time in Shop Talk history, I'm going to give you a PDF to a court document. Oh, before we get to that, most of the places I've worked at are terrified of making anything a stored procedure. There's been a lack of DBAs. What do we tell our managers when they say a stored procedure is unmaintainable?
That's the most maintainable thing there is.
Yeah, let's stipulate that we're talking specifically about SQL Server. Postgres stored procedures. Again, I don't know that any of us on chat here are qualified enough to give you a really great answer.
I think it calls it functions, Kevin.
There are procedures and there are functions. But
Really?
You're right. The concept of a procedure is different in the Oracle and Postgres world than it is in SQL Server. And they use a lot more functions than in the SQL Server world, because functions in SQL Server are anathema to good performance. So, all right, stored procedures, unmaintainable. Yeah, I agree with Tracy. They're about the most maintainable set of code because of a couple of reasons. One, my favorite reason, and the one that I think resonates best with developers, is stored procedures in the SQL Server world act as an interface. Given some set of inputs, I guarantee you will get a result set of a certain shape. So given inputs, you'll get outputs. You don't have to worry about the how behind that. Let the procedure handle it. And for people who live in object-oriented development, that whole idea just clicks with them because, well, yeah, that's why I create objects for encapsulation. That's one of the key benefits that I get from all of that. For people who work a lot with functional programming, that's why I create functions. I get out inputs, I get outputs, and I don't have to care about the mechanics of how it happens. With a stored procedure, I can take away a lot of those mechanics and get the option later on of managing that code. Let's say that I have a large query which is not performing well. I could have it in a stored procedure. Performance will not change. There's no real performance difference between I have code in a stored procedure and I'm calling ad hoc code. I say no real difference. We can talk about specific cases where you would see a difference. But on the whole, let's stipulate performance is going to be the same, or so close that we can't tell. If I have that query that's written in code, and the example here is Go code, same if it's Go, if it's C#, if it's Java, whatever. I'm going to have this query. It's going to be in code. If I need to change the query because it's not performing well, I have to modify the code. If it's a compiled language, I have to recompile the code. I have to redeploy the code and hope that that fixes my problem. Versus call a stored procedure, and now if I have a problem with performance, I can change the procedure. If I'm calling everything through stored procedures, then I get a major benefit because I can make possibly substantial changes to the tables themselves and completely encapsulate that and hide it away from the callers. So the calling code just knows I call this procedure, I get back a result that looks like this. I don't care what the underlying tables are. I care that I get back these things. And so if you have a data set of tables that aren't exactly very well set up, then we have this opportunity to make those changes without breaking all of the calling code. Because updating all that code, you're going to miss something. You're going to miss tools, like custom tools that have specialized information. You're going to have other cases where, oops, I forgot that we had this in the code base. Just a natural state of order. So I think that's the biggest reason, the biggest benefit to using stored procedures, specifically in SQL Server, and functions in Oracle or Postgres. But again, as far as Oracle and Postgres go, I'm not going to say anything about functions and their relative performance versus other variants of writing code. I can tell you for SQL Server, stored procedures are not going to have really any code difference or any performance difference. Solomon says stored procedures are better because, one, encapsulation. Yep, means the same code can now be called from SQL Agent, from reporting tools. Yeah, and also I can call it from other products, like other tools that I've written. I can rewrite my code base and I still could call the same procedures. Number two, debugging is easier. Debugging is definitely easier. If I have a problem and I'm getting back the wrong data, I can call that procedure from a management studio, from Azure Data Studio, from a command line. I don't have to have the whole code base set up and run that through a debugger. And three, security is better. Yeah, you can assign rights specifically to a stored procedure and grant privileges specifically to stored procedures, which would allow you to have users call the procedures without having rights to the underlying tables. And that means if somebody happens to exploit your web application that's available on the internet, they can call the same stored procedure. So you do have that risk. But they can't execute arbitrary code on your database. Sometimes I think an entire application can be just stored procedures. People are too quick to whip out Go, Node, or Python. Could be. I may be the wrong person to talk on that too much because I am a large proponent of having data logic in the database, and I think data logic is a lot more than just your tables. I think it includes a lot of the rules around the data rules. There is a fair amount of debate between developers and data platform professionals. And frankly, I think the correct answer is that logic goes in both places, that you don't trust the other callers. I don't trust the callers to have set things up correctly, and the callers should not necessarily trust that I have set things up correctly. But yeah, if you have an application whose entire purpose is, for example, to process data and to alert somebody, I mean, that kind of stuff can be done strictly within a database, could be done strictly within a data platform product, depending on what you're wanting to do. There are extremes. I actually ended up implementing a thing in SQL Server that was a SQL agent job that would check for issues and would post messages to a Slack channel. Actually used Solomon's SQL Sharp for that. I don't recommend that in general necessarily, but it served the purpose here because that was the way that they used, the way that they accessed messages, and it was exactly what they needed for the job. So it was definitely a lower fidelity solution than some of the other options. And I would say that obviously it's generally not going to be useful to have all the work in a database if you have something customer visible. But for cases where it's strictly internal work, there are valid cases where I don't necessarily need to go out to another language. I think there's some overlap in what you can do, and some of that is maybe I shouldn't do it. But I've also been in cases where it was so much more difficult for me to write a line of code outside of the database just to get that thing deployed and to get it hosted and to get it running, that I did things within databases that I wouldn't recommend other people do. So I think you can definitely take it to the wrong extreme. But yeah, there's a lot of cool functionality. And Viable Clan member asks, do you unit test your procedures? Sometimes. Mala, I know you've got opinions on this. And Tracy has opinions on this. So let me take a drink of water while you both...
I unit test them to the extent I can. That's my answer. And very recently at work, we implemented T-SQL-T, and I'm kind of impressed by how much unit testing we can do with that. I really like it, in fact. So we've set it up for a lot of our procedures that do updates and inserts, just mostly for that, updates, inserts, and maybe deletes too. And that's one way to do unit testing. I do think unit testing is important, especially in a world if you can't rely on your developers to test your code properly before it goes live, then I would definitely need something like that in place. And yeah, generally speaking, I recommend it, and I really recommend T-SQL-T too. I like it very much.
What do you say, Tracy?
Yes, unit tests.
Yes.
Unit tests are important so you can make sure performance is running well, you're getting back to correct result sets, and so forth and so forth. Especially when you're making changes. First time you're getting stuff, you need to make sure you're getting what you expect to get back. You need to test it against multiple data sets, not just your one dev server. Hopefully you've got more than one. and some data that's close in size to what you have in production, or you have a way of simulating that with doing hypothetical statistics and stuff like that and indexes. So
yep, I agree. Ideal world, definitely unit test. I'm a little less sanguine on unit tests on database procedures, strictly because there are too many cases where you can't effectively unit test a thing. So if you're doing certain types of work, if you have certain operations in where maybe you're creating something, you're creating procedures and tables, or that you're performing modifications, alterations, a lot of the kinds of stuff that I most want to unit test, those are the things that are most difficult to unit test, because a framework like T-SQL-T is really good about essentially mocking. It's creating mocks. It's basically temporary tables, temporary procedures, and inserting data into those and seeing what the results look like. So if you're going to fit into that scenario, then yes, unit testing, very helpful. And I've caught quite a few regressions. And Solomon mentions, yeah, a lot of these are integration tests. T-SQL-T is more of unit testing than integration testing, because what it does is creates things like temp tables to do insertions instead of inserting into the actual tables. So that's where the unit testing aspect comes from. But so StolarX, is this a reply stream or no? Yeah, we are chat driven, and so we take questions. Sometimes we give answers. Sometimes those answers even make sense. We'll find out. Hope we have more than 5 minutes for this Google case. Oh yeah. So let's talk about Google. And I'm going to drop the link in again because this is a lot of fun. This is 173 pages of light reading. This is a court case from about a dozen attorneys general in the Southern District of New York. Antitrust lawsuit against Google. Now, for those of you who don't want to read through 173 pages of a legal brief, here is one thread, which is alleged collusion. Mind you, all of this is the allegation. This is the plaintiffs who are laying out their case for court, and basically saying, here are all the bad things that Google has done to violate antitrust law. And Google, of course, has their opportunity to respond to all of this. Everything here is allegations. Nothing has been fully proved. But that said, there's a lot of real interesting information in here. And here's another thread. This is a Twitter thread from somebody who had read through all of it. The Thread Reader app link that I posted, this was a guy who went through roughly somewhere around 40% or so of the full document and found so many cases of things where it essentially Google was acting on marketplaces as the buyer, the seller, and the broker. And surprisingly, Google was using that to make sure that Google got the most money out of it all. Allegedly. Assume that I say allegedly at the end of every sentence so that I don't get sued for defamation, allegedly. But what was also interesting is a lot of this information was in early documents and it was redacted. These are the almost entirely unredacted documents. There are still a few notes that are blacked out in the case, things like employee names, but most of this, the numbers, the product names, the project names, a lot of the really dirty details, unredacted. And again, if half of this is true, this is some real bad stuff. So I search something on Google, it takes me to Amazon. I buy it, then I get ads in my email and Facebook for the very same thing I just ordered. That is a thing called retargeting. And in the advertising world, retargeting is extremely common because I know a person who just bought this thing. Or even more commonly, if you looked at it, but you didn't buy it. And what they'll do is they'll retarget you. They'll say, you were on my site, and I know that you looked at the product, so maybe you just went off and closed the window, and maybe I can get you back later. Then they'll have these advertisements display for you because they figure you've looked at this before, you might be interested. Or on Amazon, they get really weird because let's say I need to buy a toilet seat cover from Amazon. And now Amazon believes that I'm some toilet seat cover aficionado, and they will constantly send me emails. Hey, have you seen the latest set of toilet seat covers? I'm like, I just needed to buy the one. I really don't have that. That's not a hobby of mine. I don't collect them. But Amazon, they saw you, that you bought the one, and now they figure you're going to buy all of them. Nobody cared that Google was a benign monopoly and their motto was don't be evil. But now that they're obviously evil, we care. I think we cared before, but not enough people cared. I'm going to avoid politics as much as I can here. I mean, we are talking about a legal case, so there's going to be some politics involved. But Google is really good at buying legislators and also politically affiliated magazines and
making donations.
Yes.
To charities and
institutes.
Such,
yes.
And whatever, illegally, not buying.
Right. Legally. But yeah,
keeping you out of trouble here, Kevin.
Allegedly. They're really good at dropping a whole bunch of cash and getting people on different political sides to shill for them. And I think that's a big part of why you haven't seen much in the way of Google antitrust until a couple of years ago. And they're at a point where, like, if you read through this stuff, you have cases where Google is telling Microsoft and Facebook that they need to they need to stop being so focused on privacy. Mind you, Google is telling Facebook not to be so worried about privacy. This is upside down world. It is crazy, just the sheer scope and amount of things. You're talking about 11 billion online ad spaces each day processed by this. And there are some serious issues that I'm certain you don't want to get into, or we get into it big time. Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have the time to get into this very much, but Google is, for years, Google has been a strong violator of antitrust practices, allegedly. Notice how now I'm just throwing allegedly, like Google burned my family alive, allegedly. And so, yeah, no, I do agree that there's a lot of nastiness, and much of it comes out. It's 173 pages of allegations. Now, granted, again, this is alleged. This is not proven yet. But when they have documents from 2014, 2013, they have employees who are giving out information. Google was in secret meetings with other major players like Facebook advertising network, which and they were, if these records are correct, colluding against customers, which is, strictly speaking, that's antitrust right there. So I completely agree. I definitely recommend check out the ThreadReader app thread there. It's probably about a 20-minute read if you go through all of the allegations that this person found. And that was like 40% of it. The Twitter thread that I linked to basically comes up with Google has a secret deal with Facebook called Jedi Blue that they knew was so illegal they had a whole section describing how they'd cover for each other if anyone found out. There were several other products here, several other things in here that showed manipulation. They showed that if, for example, your maximum bid was $8 for a click, that Google would sometimes bid you up to $12 to $15 for a click. So I don't know, strictly speaking, if that was illegal, but at the very least, it was unethical. There were cases where Google was actively cheating in its own marketplace so that it would win, where they were actively cheating on other ad exchanges so that they would win. They were taking advantage of secret information that only they had so that they could get an unfair advantage in these advertising marketplaces, allegedly. And it's all a very interesting case. We'll see what happens The attorneys general are looking for a trial by jury, and this is probably going to shape up to be bigger than Microsoft in 95. And the real interesting thing is this is the US. Wait until the EU gets involved. Because, for example, Google told WhatsApp users, hey, you can store all your WhatsApp data, like store those backups in Google Drive. And it's end-to-end encrypted. What they don't tell you is, well, it wasn't encrypted while you're in Google Drive, and Google took all of that information and was using it. So the EU, not very friendly to such ideas, and also much more antitrust happy than the US historically has been. I think the US is going to be the prelude to the real deluge. Get ads on everything. It takes up my time. This is more annoying than useful. A lot of advertising is more annoying than useful. Completely agree with that. Brand new phone filled with ads. Anything filled with ads. Advertising, what's interesting about it is that we try to use advertising as the alternative way of providing revenue for a product. And we have commercial television. That has worked historically pretty well. But interestingly, in a lot of cases, we just ignore the ads. We have advertising on, say, news sites or advertising on pretty much any website. And as humans, we've found really good ways to mentally block ads. And then we have ad blockers, which actively block ads. I run ad blockers. I have a pie hole over here that takes out a lot of this sort of stuff. And I think overall, I don't think that advertisements are as effective as people really want them to be. So even after Google is prosecuted for monopoly behavior, their penalty will be selling Chrome to schools at a discount, right? The effective action that'll be really interesting. I mean, you could see, for example, breaking up Google. I guess you could see the Ma Bell, the Baby Bells model, but notice that 20 years later, most of those Baby Bells are back together. So I'm not sure what the answer is. You could say break off the advertising from everything else, make it a common platform market, and then Google kills a whole bunch of other programs. So maybe that's the answer. But at the same time, I don't really want the people at Google running 90% of the ad market. I don't want them to be the common exchange. So I don't like that answer much either. I don't have a good answer for what is the right approach here. But we can see that Google allegedly has severely abused its monopoly power. So StolarX says there is monopoly everywhere. Google, Facebook, Twitch, Twitter, DMV, DOJ, IRS. They're all trying to take money and time. Yeah, DMV, Department of Justice, and the IRS, they're a little bit different, given that they're actual government agencies versus granted monopolies versus effective monopolies. Twitch, less of a monopoly. A lot of it comes down to a lot of technical definitions of what constitutes a monopoly. And you have classic examples of this, like in monopoly theory, is Coke a monopoly? Are Coke and Pepsi a duopoly? If you look at the market of soft drinks that we consider in the Midwest, we call that pop, or we call it soda somewhere else. In that space, it's basically those are the two companies. They're a duopoly. However, if you include all soft drinks, they have about 30% of the market combined between the two. So across that broader range, they're not a monopoly. And usually what the Department of Justice does with antitrust is treat behaviors rather than the existence. That was in the early days, they treated this is a monopoly. This is you have X percentage of the total market. We consider that a monopoly. Behavior has changed over time as the percentage of lawyers versus economists has changed within the Antitrust Bureau. And now they're much more likely to focus on patterns and behaviors over exact percentages. It used to be that they had things like the HHI. Hirschleifer was one of the names there. It's like a Hirschleifer somebody index, and would show you what is the rough percentage of concentration in a market. Definitely use that a lot less now. And instead, it's more like, are you predating upon customers like Google allegedly has? Or is this a monopoly where, yeah, you still have prices basically the same, which is more like the soft drink market, where prices haven't, you haven't seen massive changes in prices. There's a ex-CIA guy who said at a DEF CON there's no internet privacy and never was, essentially telling him get used to it. Of course I disagree, says Mike. Yeah, I would disagree with that notion as well. I think factually it may or may not be true. Conceptually, it's not an ideal. It's not something that we should be okay with. I think Apple actually protested the Microsoft ruling. My recollection at the time was that they did. And also around that time that Microsoft gave Apple a lot of money. I forget which one came first, though. So, all right. YouTube ads taking more time than videos. Yeah, that's becoming more common. So we are going to wrap up for the evening. We're about 12 minutes over, but I did want to talk a little bit about antitrust. The economist in me got out. I need to put him back in. And while I do that, I want to say thank you all for showing up tonight, and we will catch you again in 2 weeks. Tomorrow, we have Matt Gordon, who's going to be talking to us about, let me pull up Meetup and make sure that I get this right, because I don't want to say that Matt's giving the wrong talk. Here we go. Wrapping up allegedly. Chatbots. So Matt Gordon's talking about chatbots tomorrow night, so come check that out. Meetup.com/trypass. Until we see you again, everybody, have a great evening.